Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in 1960, presidential candidate John F. Kennedy needed to win the state of Illinois to win the election. His brother Robert Kennedy called Mayor Richard Daley asking about the vote count in the critically important city of Chicago. When Robert Kennedy asked, "How many votes will we get from Chicago?" Mayor Daley responded, "How many votes do you need?" The Democrat Party has a long history of stealing elections in this country. Our chairman knows very well the history of New York City Democrat politics, with the Democrat bosses in Tammany Hall stealing elections for decades. Whether it's Huey Long in Louisiana or the Black Panthers in Philadelphia, the Democrat Party relies on corruption and voter intimidation to win elections. In 2016, we even witnessed the Democrat Party stealing an election from one of its own candidates, as Hillary Clinton's allies rigged the primaries against Bernie Sanders. Now, Mr. Chairman, we are presented with H.R. 1, the Democrat Party's wish list written by special interest groups. And here we go again. This bill works like the Chicago-style Democrat machine. It does nothing to clean up voter rolls that haven't been reviewed in years, allowing dead people and those who have moved away to continue voting. A friend told me a story about his uncle, who was a lifelong resident of Chicago and a lifelong Republican voter. His family learned that after he died, he cast his first vote for a Democrat. This bill fails to remove and even prevents removal of fraudulently registered individuals. It even mandates the counting of provisional ballots, whether those ballots are cast by citizens or not. Look at Texas, where officials found 95,000 non-citizens have been registered to vote and 58,000 non-citizens voted in Texas elections. It doesn't take a genius to see that this can happen anywhere without proper oversight. This bill also infringes on the state's right to determine whether felons may vote, criminalizes free speech, and weaponizes the Federal Election Commission. H.R. 1 does nothing to make elections fairer. Mr. von Spakovsky, any thoughts on the history of election fraud in this country?
Well, I would quote the U.S. Supreme Court in 2008, a decision written by Justice John Paul Stevens, in which they talked about the fact that, unfortunately, the United States has a long history of voter fraud documented by journalists and historians. We started and it can make the difference in a close election. Anyone who believes it doesn't occur can look at the news and see the Alabama mayor who was just removed after being convicted of absentee ballot fraud. We've got a database at the Heritage Foundation with documented cases from across the country. We have almost 1,200 cases, and these are not just allegations in a newspaper of someone saying they think they saw something wrong at a poll. The only thing we put in our database are cases where someone has actually been convicted of engaging in election fraud, or a court has found fraud and ordered a new election. Some of these are isolated cases. One gentleman that we have who was convicted of voting in 3 different states. But there are other cases where it's organized, and particularly often in absentee ballot fraud cases is an organized effort to do that. How widespread is the problem? Well, we don't know that. But there are enough instances of it that the Supreme Court thought it was sufficient to justify the voter ID law that the state of Indiana had passed, and that's why they upheld it in the opinion that was written by Justice John Paul Stevens.
Does H.R. 1 improve, or does H.R. 1 limit the ability of those who want to commit fraud, or does it actually expand the ability of those who want to commit fraud?
Oh, I think it's going to make it easier to commit fraud, and I would point to the fact that it severely restricts the ability of states basically amending the provisions that I think Congress wisely put into the National Voter Registration Act, but it amends those provisions to make it even more difficult to verify and check the accuracy of voter registration rolls. And remember, when when it was upheld by the Supreme Court, they pointed to a prior report that found there are almost 3 million individuals registered in more than one state, almost 2 million individuals who are deceased who are still on the rolls.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.